So much of our experience is unconscious, the past informing the way we perceive, express, relate, and create. Our task is to illuminate all the ways the past has decontextualized into the present, set a compassionate boundary, and discover a new way forward. Peace and power is the goal. Welcome to Decontextualized. I'm Natalia Rachel. Today's episode is exploring energy mastery. I'll be speaking with Simon Alexander Ong, author of Energize, Make the Most of Every Moment, international keynote speaker and coach. But before we begin, let's take a moment to settle into our intention for our time together, to listen, to respond, to explore beyond what we think we know. Take a nice breath in, and as you exhale, let go of bias, let go of judgment, let go of agenda or any fixed outcome. Welcome your curious mind and your receptive heart. And from here, let's meet today's wonderful guest, Simon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get started. Tell us all about you as a man, a father, a coach, an author, a thought leader. Let's get to know you a bit.
So when I grew up here in the United Kingdom, I had this mistaken belief that success would be defined by the job title that I held. So when I went through the educational system, my focus was on being either a banker, a lawyer, a doctor, or an accountant. When I graduated, I went into the banking industry at what was probably the worst moment. It was the middle of 2007, a year before the global financial crisis. And the first company that I worked at was Lehman Brothers, which collapsed into administration 14 months after I joined. So talk about a volatile start to your career. It was as volatile as you could get. But even though it was painful at the time, and I felt that my future was being swept away from under my feet, in hindsight, it was such a beautiful blessing in disguise, because it kickstarted for me the longest journey that we as humans make, the inches from our heads to our hearts. And that led me to what I now get to do today, which is to coach some extraordinary individuals, to speak on stages across the world, and write my first book, Energize, with Penguin Random House, which came at a time where I became a father for the first time. In April 2020, as the world went into lockdown, I got a book deal, I became a father for the first time, and of course, as many of us did across the planet, we had to navigate this time of uncertainty. However, being a parent is the most rewarding job title that I hold. And I'm learning from it every single day.
What's your child's name?
Her name is Sienna, and she just turned 3 a couple of months ago.
And what's the biggest learning that you've had being her daddy?
The biggest learning I've had so far, being her father, is that children don't want our time as much as they want our energy and our presence, to be there in the present moment with them and to enjoy life's little moments. I think that's what is their love language, is having that presence with their parents.
I completely agree that underneath it all, whether we're children or adults, that's what we're seeking, presence and connection without agenda.
Indeed, it's just to kind of be open to that moment and to connect at a human level, as you said, beyond any agenda, any bias, any opinion. It's just being open and connecting one human to another.
I think we forget that growing up, and I agree that when we become parents, seeing the purity of our children and just connecting to their needs and how simple they are to respond to, it's a big reconnection to who we are as humans, isn't it?
Yeah, It reminds us about what matters most. In the business of the everyday, we can easily forget that it's the smallest moments in life that are actually the big things that matter. And once you become a parent, as I did a couple of years ago, it really shifts your perspective, not just about your world, but also about what's important for your future. Often before we become a parent, it's about me, me, me. I think once you become a parent, you realize it's about the impact you're having on the lives of other people. And that could not be more true than the impact that you have on your children.
I completely agree. My sort of great spiritual belief is that all the healing work we do, all the learning and growth we do, it's so that our children will have to do less of it. And that their life will be with more ease. They're not going to end up in therapy rooms and coaching rooms like we have. They're going to just know how to do all the things we've been working so hard to. So I think it is like an intergenerational healing that is what our generation is here to do, to just make it a little softer for our children. And I really believe our grandchildren are going to go on and create a world that we can't even yet fathom.
You're so right, because just as you were speaking, it brought to mind this beautiful Bruce Lee quote, which goes, "Do not buy your children the things you didn't have. Instead, teach your children the things that you were never taught." And I think that's where we can really have an impact, is to give them that head start. I mean, for me, I didn't really go into the world of personal development or really explore my own wisdom and do my own self-healing until I was into my mid to late 20s. So if I can give my children those sort of lessons at such an early age, I think that gives them the most powerful springboard to build a thriving future.
I agree. I grew up in a very difficult childhood. And so when I give my children now all of the things that I wasn't afforded,
Yeah.
I can see that intergenerational healing or shift taking place because they are relaxed, they are attuned, they are authentic, they can say no and speak up,
Mhm.
and not get caught up in like losing themselves. And I just think, wow. And sometimes I get cheery about it because I'm like, gosh, all the work's paying off. Mine are a bit older than yours. Mine are 8 and 10. So
Fantastic.
we've been talking about presence and energy go together. You're really known for your work around the concept of energize. So in a nutshell, what does this mean to you?
Sure. So energy, in essence, is life force. And we all know about it through different cultures and practices, but few of us know how to nurture it. So if you practice yoga, you would call it prana. If you are from the Maori culture, you would call it mana. If you're from my Chinese culture, you would call it qi. And if you are a fan of the Star Wars film franchise, you would describe it as the force. Now, whatever term we use to describe it, we're talking about the same thing, which is energy as a life force. And when we deconstruct energy, we can really see it through 4 dimensions: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. But most of us only focus on the physical. So when we feel exhausted and we feel drained, the first things that come to mind are things such as, I need more rest. I need to move my body. I need to eat better. And these are the obvious, and these are all pillars of physical energy. But we tend to neglect the parts of energy that we cannot see: our emotional energy, our mental energy, and our spiritual energy. Yet these are so important to helping us live in the moment and in fulfilling our potential. To give an example, I'm often asked, Simon, what do you mean about spiritual energy? And I make it easy for people to understand by putting it this way. I say, if we look at society around us, what we tend to observe is that most are exhausted, not because they are physically doing too much, but because one, they are doing too little of the things that bring them joy. And second, they are running someone else's race. And this is all about spiritual energy, which brings to mind meaning, purpose, and story. And if we can address those areas, we end up waking up every day in such a different state of mind.
Why do you think people find it hard to connect to the unseen layers? To me, it's natural based on where I am now, but I know back in the day before I started my journey, I wasn't aware of any, and most people in this world are not aware of all of these dimensions of energy that you speak about. Why? What's blocking us?
It goes back to something I shared earlier in the sense that the longest journey we make are the inches from our heads to our hearts. And many of us have not started that journey yet. And I think that part of the reason why we are not exploring ourselves inwardly is, firstly, we don't make the time for it. We don't feel it is important. We are in a culture that glorifies busyness. If you're not doing something, then you cannot be productive. If you're just sitting there doing nothing, if you're just sitting there writing or out in nature, how is that productive? So according to society's definition of busyness, then doing this inner work is not productive. And so the first hurdle is to actually see the act of inward reflection and self-awareness as something that is productive. So I think that's the first hurdle, is that we can be seduced by this idea that we have to hustle 24/7. We've got to be in doing mode. Otherwise, what's the point? Second is, I think that few of us haven't got to that stage where we take responsibility for where we are and where we're going. It's so much easier to blame something or someone else for our circumstance. But I think that when we take responsibility for where we are and where we want to be, that's when the work really begins. I mean, when I look back at my journey, I know that the only reason I started doing the inner work and I started shifting my energetic signature was because where I was in my life was not where I wanted to be. And I knew that whatever I wasn't changing, I was choosing. And I did not like what I was choosing. So as soon as I started to take responsibility, paths began to open in the most magical of ways. And I think the third has to do with validation. We, as part of the human condition, we like to feel validated by other people, whether it's our parents, our friends, our partners, even our bosses. We want to feel validated. So when we do something that is different, that isn't what most people do, we're not quite sure if that would be accepted. And also, we don't like to look like a beginner. We don't like to look like we don't know what we're doing. And so I think those are the things that come to mind that stop people doing some of that work.
There's so much in what you've just said right now. There's a couple of things I want to respond to. I completely agree that we are so obsessed with productivity that anything that's not outcome oriented or agenda focused, particularly when it comes to achievement or status or money, we see as not acceptable or not worthy. And it's interesting, you frame it as, well, to work on oneself, one's development is productive. The way I lean into it is, perhaps we actually don't need to be productive all the time because we are not products. And I think there does need to be this huge reframe around why we're pushing ourselves to be products, because humans are not. And I think we're at this really interesting time in the world of self-commoditization. So you and I, we both have personal brands, we're authors, we're speakers, and in one way we're products. But you and I both know how to switch it off and look after ourselves. I think so many people can't find that boundary. So they just continue on as a product all the time. And that's really dangerous. What do you think about that? The invitation to actually not treat ourselves as a product and not need to see anything that is for ourselves as productive.
And I think this is where awareness comes into play, because if you have awareness on when you are a product and when you're not, and the importance of balance and boundaries, then you can move forward, even though sometimes you will be seeing yourself like a product, like as you said, with personal brands, and the fact that we may also be selling products as well. But having the awareness of when to switch off and when to spend time just in solitude, in reflection, and just finding that healthy balance between moving forward, resting, doing the inner work, that requires a level of awareness of what goes on in your world.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not aware, what happens is you can easily get caught up by everything around you and be chasing something that is completely meaningless. I remember there was a book I read by the Japanese author Fumio Sasaki, and the title of the book was Goodbye Things. And what he did, which was very extreme, is that he sold 80% of his possessions and he created a very minimal life. And what he noticed in the process was that prior to doing so, the things that he owned ended up owning him. And he said that in this space that he created, he began to appreciate everything he already had. And he said we can so easily overlook the things that we already have in our lives that we end up seeking things that take the joy away from what we already had. And that we end up on this hamster wheel chasing and chasing and chasing when actually we already have everything right now.
I completely agree with these sentiments, but I think context is really important. And because we live in this hustle-driven world, we get caught up in capitalism, essentially, and the grind of the modern world, where we're being flooded with advertising messages and self-help stuff, and we're a part of it, saying, look, here's something else, here, more, better. And I think it's so hard, again, to find that awareness and set that boundary and come out of it. So it requires deep spiritual practice. And I think most people don't have the awareness or the strength to do it.
And that's why when you talk on boundaries, I think the first step is knowing what is important for you. Because if you don't know what you're working towards, if you don't know what your own definition of success is, how can you have boundaries? Because you don't know what to protect. You don't know what to say yes and no to. And so I think the very first step, which is what I explored in my own journey, is I sat down and I asked myself things such as, Simon, what does fulfillment look like to you? What sort of impact do you want to have in this short life of yours? And once I started to get those answers onto paper, my challenge was to build my life and career around what I put onto paper. Because once I knew what those answers were, it was so much easier to create boundaries and to protect my energy for what mattered. So when something came in my inbox or somebody asked me if I could be involved in a particular project, I knew if that was a yes or no. And if it was a no, I would find a way to politely decline. And if it was a yes, I would put all of my energy into giving it my best. But if we don't know what we're working towards, then it's so difficult to understand the boundaries that we should create. And so I think that's the challenge that people have, is it's easy to know what you don't want, but it's harder to know what you actually want out of life. And that's a process. It's not something you get one morning when you wake up and you have an epiphany of everything you want to have in your life. It's a process of following our curiosities.
I think so many of us were never taught that we had a choice. Just like you were sharing at the beginning of our conversation, there's a trajectory laid out. You're going to be a lawyer or a doctor or an economist, and this is your path. And so I think there's this restructuring we need to do where we actually allow that space for ourselves. We get to inquire, we get to be curious, and there's no shame in it. And I think that shame piece comes up for so many when they do start going to this journey of going for the life they want and putting these boundaries in place, because we've been taught from the very beginning that would be wrong or bad, or cause judgment or exclusion. So it's this huge social construct that we're dealing with.
And that's why it's, as you alluded to, it's not easy. Because when you've grown up with that construct for so many years, often decades, it's a challenge to deconstruct that and re-engineer the way that you want to proceed in your own version of reality. In fact, when we think about reality, there is no one same reality for us all. We live in customized realities. And for me, that's a good thing, because it means that we are both the sculptor and the sculptor. Moment to moment to moment, we're living in the feeling of our thinking. And we get to choose what those thoughts are. The way I like to think about it is that life is a blank canvas, and we get to choose what we paint on it. Yet so many of us give up control of that paintbrush to someone else. But when we take back control of that paintbrush, we get to choose the colors, the patterns, and the pictures that we put onto that canvas. Once we are in control of that brush, for me, anything is possible.
I really agree with you, and I love the paintbrush and the canvas analogy. But when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I agree. But I'm also thinking, if I were to be back where I was 20 years ago, or if I were to be one of the many people that I work with who are going through trauma and who are still living in oppressive or harmful dynamics, to hear this analogy would be really triggering.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people are in circumstances where they don't have control of their paintbrush, and their lived experiences, I'm never going to get my paintbrush back. So how would you, I guess, shift or alter this concept to speak to these people? Because I really believe that all of the concepts in this kind of work are so important and powerful, but that the masses actually can't get it when it's expressed in this language, which is along the lines of, you're in charge, the world is your oyster, when they're really, really having a lived neurophysiological, relational, social experience of that is not true. What do you think?
I can agree, because I myself have gone through traumatic experiences growing up. I think I shared with you when we first met that when I was 17, I lost my mum to a tragic accident. And it was unexpected. So mentally and physically, I was not prepared. And this was at a time in history where mental health wasn't as mainstream as it is now in terms of resources and tools that you can access. And I think when I look back at that, and in reference to the context you gave, there are things that we can control and there are things that we cannot control. And I think that is applicable to any scenario that we go through in life, personal or professional. And the thing is, we have to begin by focusing on the things that we can control. And when you are in a traumatic experience where things do not feel as bright as you would like them to feel, it's simply to focus on the smallest, tiniest thing that you can control right now. And through my experience, even through the passing of my mom, there is always something small that you can do. Something small just to feel a little bit happier in that moment. Now, it's not to say your circumstance is going to magically transform overnight, but what you're doing is a small act of self-love, a small act of showing yourself that there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. That actually, while right now may be a dark period, what I can learn from this is not only more about myself, but how I can use this to come back stronger and turn my mess into a message. And so I agree with what you said there, is that some of what I shared is on the other side. When you are at the beginning and you cannot see the other side, or you cannot see over the wall that you're behind at the moment, it's simply to begin with the smallest thing that you can do right now.
That really resonates for me. It ties to the concept of agency and choice and participatory power. So every time we make one act of agency and choice, every time we choose something,
Mm.
we're accessing our will and we're growing the amount of power inside us, which is the remedy to that frozen, disempowered state that we're in. So I really love that. Um, there's a concept of locus of control. So when we're in that frozen, disempowered state, our locus of control is firmly outside of us. And every time we choose, we learn to kind of move it back towards us. So we feel like we're not totally at the mercy of the big bad world.
Yeah,
Um,
and I remember I first came across this idea of locus of control from Viktor Frankl's work. You know, who lived through the Holocaust, which is an experience I don't think any of us could relate to, living through that period of history in a concentration camp. And even he had to understand that there were lots of things outside of his control. But the one thing in his control was how he managed his mind and how he interpreted and lived through what were very horrific circumstances.
Thanks for bringing that in. So my lineage goes through World War II.
Mm.
My grandmother lived in Poland, just like Anne Frank, and she hid and
Yeah.
she changed her name and dyed her hair and got on a boat to Australia. So that really touches me that you brought that into the conversation. Um, and I think so many of us are holding those intergenerational wounds. And isn't
Yeah.
it so interesting that the remedy and the way forward back then is the same way now? I think so many of the principles of healing and growth just transcend generations. It's just that we've forgotten. And so work like yours helps us to remember who we
Mm.
are and our innate power. It's pretty beautiful.
Indeed, I think that as we grow up, it's so easy to forget how powerful we are and how much agency we can have. Because, as you said, we have these social structures that appear to take away that personal power we have. I mean, when I look at my 3-year-old daughter, she's so creative, she's so free, she's so present, and she's curious about the world. But when children grow up, and I can relate from my own experience, we tend to lose that creative spark. We tend to lose that curiosity, and we end up conforming to the majority in society. But the funny thing is, with the people I work with and the audiences I speak to, when they begin tapping back again into that creative energy, exploring that curiosity, they often tell me, Simon, I feel like I'm living again. And that is the purpose of life. It is to live with intention. It is to have the best adventure that you can have. I mean, we are seduced to think that we want comfort, but what we as humans actually want is adventure.
The word seduced is really interesting. The word I want to challenge it with is coerced. I think we're feared and shamed into comfort and into line and order. And so many of us are terrified to be curious and playful and go against the grain. I wouldn't call it seduction at all. What do you think of that?
I think it's the reason I say seduced is because of the impact of social media. So when people these days turn on their phone, what do you see on your Instagram feed, your LinkedIn, or your Facebook feed? You're seduced by the images of what life can look like when it's comfortable. A nice
Mhm.
house, a flashy looking car, traveling in style. And so these are the comforts that we end up seeking because we then talk about it, we then hold it up as a bit of prestige that if we're there, we're living a comfortable life and how good it is to have the comfortable life. And so that's what I guess, came to my mind when I use the word seduce, is because they are easily attractive to people who don't have the awareness to understand what really matters in our life journey.
Thanks for clarifying that. As I'm listening to you, I also think it feeds into that validation piece that you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier. So when I have this checklist of items or experiences or labels in my sphere, I'm more valid, I'm more worthy as a human,
Yeah.
I'm winning, and I'm doing what I'm meant to be. And so I think breaking free from trying to get the validation in the wrong places is so important.
And I think this is where ego plays in hand, because the ego wants to be validated. The ego wants to be seen to be cool. The ego wants to be seen as winning. And I was also at that point in my life when I was working in the financial services industry. I wanted to be seen to be having a good job, to be paid well, to be working for a prestigious company. But in order for me to embark on the journey to do what I now get to do, which is very different to those traditional jobs I mentioned earlier, and my family had no idea about the work I was doing. I mean, the first response I remember my family telling me when I told them I was a coach, they were saying, "Simon, but don't you have to get lots of qualifications to coach sports teams and athletes?" And I said to them, it's not that type of coaching. And so it took a while for them to understand. But what gave me the courage to make that transition was dropping the ego and focusing on being more humble, on having more humility, to understand that there is so much I can learn and I'm never going to know it all. And the only way I'm going to begin on this process is by doing the work myself and surrounding myself with teachers. To admit that is a big step from ego to humility.
I think there's a piece around letting go of the need of validations from the voices that were invalidating us in the first place and seeking validation and support and nurture from people who can really give it to us in the right way. Because
Yeah,
I think our authority figures, if whether they're our parents or our elders or our community or our bosses, are often the ones invalidating us when they should be validating us. And so I think that it's another boundary, isn't it, to say, I'm not going to let your voice define who I am or how I feel about myself. And I'm
mm,
going to go and find people who nurture the best version of me or the version of me that I want to become.
yeah. And as you were describing, I mean, the sort of picture that came up in my head was one of a boat in an ocean, and it's sailing towards dry land. And the ocean may be full of negativity, of social structures that are meant to force you to conform to a certain ideal. If you are aware, you can block out the water and keep it from coming into your boat. But if you're not aware, then that water will come flooding into your boat and you will start to have this sinking feeling. And you cannot move forward because you feel like there is no sight or hope that will bring you towards dry land. But when you have this level of awareness, you can navigate your boat towards dry land more effortlessly without allowing that ocean of doubt, fears, validation, negativity, or toxicity enter your boat to stop you making progress.
Love this. Another great analogy today. Thank you. So let's talk about the fallout, because we were talking a little bit about how sometimes you have to learn to put that boundary with the voices in your life that aren't really nurturing you and supporting you. So it's common that when we do start to put those healthy boundaries in place and we're claiming our energy, our light, our life force, our prana, our force, whatever we're going to call it, that we end up having to let go of people or places or opportunities that really aren't in line with our own vibrancy. So, how did this manifest in your life? What did you have to say no to or let go of?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, as I evolved, I found myself very quickly spending time with different people, because what I realized is that not everybody around you will evolve at the same speed that you do. And as you become aware of people's energy, you become more conscious of the energy that you want to spend time around, because it really influences the way you see yourself and the way you see a world. So what I had to let go was of some relationships. I mean, I'm still in touch with many of the people that I went to school with and I started my career in the financial world with. But I, over time, started to spend a lot less time with them. the books I read changed. You know, I didn't read much after I graduated from formal education, but before long, my thirst for learning rose, and I found myself reading book after book after book. The places I spent time changed. I was more deliberate and intentional with where I wanted to spend my hours every day. And as I share some of these examples with you, it reminds me of a response I had to a question recently when someone said, Simon, what is the fastest way to make progress in any area of your life? And my response was, design an environment around you that makes it impossible not to make the progress that you want to make. And that's things such as the people we spend time with, the books we read, the podcasts we listen to, what we watch, the physical spaces we spend time in. All of this stuff influences our journey in life.
Everything is energy, isn't it? And we're picking up information in every direction, every dimension all the time, and it's shaping us.
Totally. And I think that energy is neutral. And what I mean by that is that if you spend time around negative energy, in no time, you will be negative. If you spend time around positive energy, in no time, you will be positive. And I think once we appreciate how much energy is everything, then we can begin redesigning our days, our weeks, and our months to be around much more positive sources of energy. And what we notice is you end up making more progress in weeks and months than you may have made in years or decades. And that's because when you have the energy inside of you, it doesn't matter if you're time poor, you end up doing far more than you ever imagined.
That really resonates to me. A little of my story, I don't know if you know much about my story, but I was sick for a very long time. So I was trapped in the medical system for 17 years and I was very sick. You know, there were periods I couldn't walk or use my hands. You know, I was really sick, intravenous treatments, medications. And no matter what I tried, and I tried everything, I couldn't shift. I couldn't get out of it. And so there was this, I guess, universally guided move out of the country. And as I left the country, I left the toxic systems and environments and the energy that was perpetuating what was going on for me. And so it was only once I was removed from that environment that I had what the doctors believed was this, you know, miracle healing. But to me, one of the biggest pieces was not having all of these inputs into my system, my being, and having the space to create a safe, nurturing environment where there was enough, I guess, support and silence for me to go inward and do the very deep, extreme healing work that I needed to do to heal all of the trauma that had got me there in the first place. So I deeply believe environment and relationships and the things that we're feeding ourselves are such a big piece, and it links into the whole sort of systemic piece of mental health and well-being. How if we're really, really stuck and disempowered in places or systems or within dynamics and relationships that are hurting us, it's going to be really hard to heal.
And if I may, when you think back, what was the trigger point that gave you that decision to want to move out of the country to seek a better environment?
I didn't choose it. It was forced upon us. It was really, so back then I was married. I'm now divorced for some time. But I was very sick. I had two young babies. My ex-husband was working for Meta and he was gone 80% of the time traveling. And they said, look, we've got a great job for you in Singapore, but if you don't take it, you'll be made redundant. And, you know, we had a mortgage, big mortgage, two kids, sick wife. So we're like, well, we're going to Singapore. So that one was divinely sent. But there were many other boundaries and choices that I set. And one in particular was around saying, I'm done with medicine. I'm done with being sick. I'm done with this reality. You're talking about different realities. And the darkest time in my life, my youngest was 6 months old and I was in hospital. I couldn't use either of my legs. I was in severe pain. I was on oxygen. and they put me on ketamine to try and restart my nervous system because I was just screaming in pain and it had already been 10 years. And so they thought, we're just going to zap her, which was, by the way, the most traumatizing, awful experience of my life. But there
Oh,
was a reset. So during that time, I closed my eyes thinking I'm going to die, like that it's the end. And I closed my eyes thinking it's over. And then all of a sudden, I was floating above. And
oh,
it was like a montage of my children's lives without
mm,
me. So I was seeing them at different ages. And that's when that life force and that agency kicked in. And I was like, this is not happening. And so I came back to my body. And then I woke up and it took me a long time to move again. And I buzzed for the nurse and I said, put me in a wheelchair. I want to go outside.
mm.
And I said, get me a counselor. I want to talk. And to me, that was the pivotal moment where I said, I'm done with this reality and I'm done with this identity. And it was a profound moment of non acceptance, which I believe so many of us in these really awful, traumatic, I want to swear, I'm going to fucked up situations. We need to connect to that level of divine rage
Yeah.
to say, this isn't my life anymore.
And then, sorry, just another question came up in my head on the back of that is that many of us have to go through a personal tragedy or trauma, like the one you mentioned, so whether it's a loss of a parent, the potential of not being with your children, a health scare, or whatever else linked to that. How do we arrive at those decisions without having to go through that personal trauma? Because often it's only when we're faced with, no other choice. I have to make that decision. But how do we stop ourselves from having to experience that in order to make a different decision?
I feel like this is going to be shifting over the next 10 years
Mm,
to 20
mm,
years. And I think it's work like yours and mine, this education and
mm.
storytelling that supports others to see where they are before they get there. They can
Yeah,
see they're on that downward spiral. But if you think back, or I think back to whatever 10, 20, 30 years ago, none of this stuff was mainstream. It might have been in the spiritual books in the back corner of the library, but it wasn't on, it wasn't on social media. It wasn't available in a corporate space. So I think more and more of us are going to recognize much earlier. And again, another spiritual belief that I hold is that those like you or me or others who are speaking similar truths, who have gone to those rock bottoms, that was for a reason, so that we could
mm,
do the healing work to then be able to educate others. A spiritual mentor of mine many years ago, at the beginning of my healing journey, she said that to me very clearly, like, you went through this early. And she said, in some years now, everybody's going to be going through the same. And to me, COVID is that. COVID has triggered a rock bottom for so many, which is why we're seeing so much about mental health, and this explosion of rage and people leaving their jobs, and just everyone is setting that boundary and saying, I'm done. It's heal or die right now. So I
mm.
think we're in a shifting landscape. What do you think?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that there were so many lessons from the COVID pandemic. My hope is that we don't forget them now that the world has returned to
Mm.
some sort of normality. Because I remember when we were in the COVID pandemic and people were posting and sharing videos on social media talking about how they will forever be grateful for hugging someone, for having a coffee with someone, for walking in the park with someone, from actually going into an office and being next to colleagues. Now that we're back to doing all those things again, I just hope we don't forget those lessons, because I think that the COVID pandemic has been a great teacher. And it has also been a great catalyst, as you mentioned, for shifting the way that people see their reality and what's important. I just hope we continue to remember those lessons and use them as a way to move forward in our own healing journey.
I hope so too. I believe there's going to be further polarization. So there'll be those who really run with this intention to heal and create this systemic change. And there will be those who fall deeper into those old ways. And many spiritual teachers are sharing similar, that we're at this tipping point where it's
Yeah.
kind of like you go one way or another. But I think more and more people are waking up and
Mm,
choosing to create the dynamics and the conditions for their vitality, for their energy. So I've got
mm.
a slightly strange question. Maybe it's not so strange, but when I am listening to you and speaking with you, everything that you're sharing and all of your work feels deeply spiritual to me. Yet you're working mainly like within a corporate context and on stages and speaking to people in workplaces. And I wondered if you've ever come across people saying this is too spiritual or too woo-woo, and how have you responded to it if you have?
Sure. So you're right. I'm a very spiritual person. I have always believed that there is a super power beyond us, and I believe that we are all connected to one another. And what makes us who we are is consciousness. And the more conscious we become, the more aware we are of our uh, connection and access to abundance. I haven't yet been told that my work is too spiritual when it comes to the corporate world and the conference I do. And I think the reason is it's because before I go onto a stage or before I speak to an audience, I'm always making sure that the stories I tell and the way I present it is accessible for whoever the audience is. So to give an example, I spoke to a room of people from the media and film industry, and the analogies I used and the stories I used were very different to the ones I would normally use to a more public audience. So when they said to me, how does your coaching work in practice? I could have gone spiritual, but I said to them, my coaching works a little bit like Inception. If you've seen the film Inception starring Leonardo DiCaprio. And so I used that film as an analogy of the work that I do. And so the audience got it straight away. They were like, wow, so you can do Inception on me. And so for me, what I'm doing is I'm always tweaking and refining my message so that it lands with the audience that I'm speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by making it current and accessible, it allows people to then want to learn more. And if they want to learn more, then I can get more spiritual.
Beautiful. I love that. The first rule of relational intelligence is meet people where they are. And so that's exactly what you're doing. And I seek to do that too in my own way. I think the way we connect is so important. And I also believe so many people fall into the trap of expressing to express themselves rather
Yeah.
than expressing so people can hear and receive. And I would love to see more people learning to speak to be heard, not to speak to speak. Because I think it would change our world, right?
I think it would, because if we really want to spread our message, if we really want to get people learning about the principles and the philosophies that we're talking about, we have to make it accessible. A lot of people I know like to talk jargon or make things sound complex or difficult to understand because it makes them feel clever
It's
and it
divisive.
makes them feel very knowledgeable. But that doesn't help the audience, because then you make it harder for them to understand the message that you're trying to share. And for me, there's a great story that shows how important simplicity is when it comes to communicating your message. So the author Ernest Hemingway, the myth goes that he was invited by some colleagues of his to put together a 6-word story that would move an audience emotionally. I mean, can you imagine taking on that challenge? It's like, hey, Simon, put together a 6-word story, and it has to get the audience into it emotionally. But Hemingway accepted. And so he went away and he thought to himself, what 6-word story could I put together? He comes back, he sits in front of the audience, and he takes out this bit of paper and he reads out the 6-word story to the audience. For sale, baby shoes never worn. And the audience is stunned into silence, moved emotionally. And what Hemingway taught the audience is that less is more. the ability to simplify your message in a way where anybody can get it is what will allow us to communicate in the most effective way.
Beautiful. So do you have a 6-word story that you can share?
I don't, unfortunately, but I'm always working on stories, analogies, and statements that allow people to get the core of what I'm trying to say instantly, because that's what I took away from that anecdote.
Beautiful. I resonate with that as a writer. While I was listening to you, I made up one. Shall I share it with you?
I'd love to hear it.
I'm taking that challenge. Say no, choose your life, heal.
I like it.
So this has been such a beautiful and textured conversation. I'm really grateful to spend time with you. I wonder before we finish, because I know you've got a day to get on with, if there's one clear message that you would like to share with everybody listening, what would it be?
I think there's one reminder that I would like to share, and it is the fact that you and I are a miracle. I mean, for a moment, just reflect on this. The odds of you being born, the odds of your parents deciding to try for a child, the odds that your parents could have a child, the odds that your extended family, going back in history, survived multiple pandemics and wars and famines and so on. We wish we would win the national or the regional lottery, but yet we have already won the greatest lottery there is going, the lottery of life. And so the question I would love to leave you with is this: what are you going to do with that winning ticket of yours?
Very poignant way to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Simon, for taking the time to connect and share today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your time, your presence, and your receptivity. The better we understand how we have decontextualized, the more we can begin to co-create a kinder and more intelligent world. If this episode stirred you, please like it, leave a comment, or share it. To learn more about my work, visit nataliarachel.com or connect with me via LinkedIn, Instagram, or YouTube. For now, leaving you with intentions for healing and collaborative, innovative regeneration.